To start things off, I'm a 26-year-old woman. I'm also quite petite, which can make me appear a lot younger than I really am. I'm a New Hampshire resident, and I live a rather short distance away from a state hospital known as Concord. I used to work in the Steeplegate Mall, which unfortunately has been dying due to the lack of foot traffic. Naturally, many stores ended up shutting down because of that. The mall has become more of a dead zone by the day, making it a hotspot for shady people. There have been many times when I've seen people who were clearly under the heavy influence of drugs hanging around. I'm not sure if it was heroin or whatever, but you could tell just by looking at these people and trying to communicate with them that they just weren't all there. Some of these customers would even walk in bleeding without even knowing how it happened. Now that you understand the details, let's get into the story. One night, my friend, who I'll refer to as Tony, and I decided to take an Uber into town. I was feeling a bit down over some drama that was happening in my personal life. Tony wanted to cheer me up and get me out of the house for a while. We were having a great time going into the stores and getting in our exercise. The mall would be closing soon, so we decided to take advantage of my employee discount and grab something to eat. We exited the mall around 8 p.m., and it was pretty dark outside. The parking lot was mostly empty, aside from a few cars. We were making our way to the art store when we suddenly saw a white car drop someone off. This person appeared to be male, but we couldn't quite see his face. He soon disappeared into the bushes. Tony was keeping an eye on the man while I was watching the driver peel out of the parking lot. We both thought that would be the end of the white car, but less than a minute later, the car came back around, now attempting to get closer to us. It would peel out on the pavement, getting more and more aggressive the closer it got. Tony and I were both scared by this point. It felt as if my heart was about to pop out of my throat. Tony looked like she was in utter shock and disbelief. I quickly started to look for a place we could possibly hide and saw the back door to a Bon Time that went out of business. I suggested to Tony that we should make a break for that door. Our legs were sore from all the walking we'd done that day, but the primal fear that we were both feeling propelled us forward. We booked it through the back door, figuring it would at least buy us some time, and we could call for help. However, we entered a small room that had another door that led into the main area. That door was locked, preventing us from going any further. We pulled out our phones. My heart sank. I realized my phone was dead, and Tony's phone was glitching out so bad that it was unusable. She was struggling with her phone when we both heard the car slowly drive by the door. I immediately felt my stomach drop. I thought that this would be the end. Whoever this psychopath was, they were going to kidnap me and my friend, and this is how we would die. Luckily, it seemed the driver lost interest and drove off in a hurry. It took a lot of courage for us to even open the door. We left as quietly as we could. After multiple attempts of restarting her phone, Tony was finally able to get it to work. She then called up an Uber driver to drive us home. The next day, I brought this up to my boss, and she told me there had been a lot of suspicious people coming through that end of the mall. Apparently, a charter school was located in that area, and some sketchy individuals had been spying on the children there. Mall security would be patrolling that area much more thoroughly from then on. Tony and I are convinced that this person may have thought we were kids that attended that school because of our appearance, and early September the store that I worked at ended up closing as well. And not even a month after I stopped working there, there was a shooting in the mall parking lot. It was ruled a murder-suicide. A woman was shot by her boyfriend, and then he turned the gun on himself. He was found dead at the scene, and the woman was taken to the hospital where she later succumbed to her injuries after being harassed in the parking lot that night. Now, hearing about the shooting in the area, let's just say Tony and I will be staying away from there forever onward. It's clearly not a very safe place to be. We both learned a valuable lesson that night. Never walk to a parking lot in spots where most people can't see you, especially at night, and make sure your phone is always charged because you never know when you might need it. This happened about 5 or 6 years ago. I was in my mid-20s, and I lived in a small town with access to a lake, which made it a popular spot for tourists from the northern suburbs of Chicago. It was early in the fall, so tourist season was winding down, and things were starting to return to a more quiet, if not somewhat boring, pace. I was off work that day, and I decided to get out and enjoy some fresh air. For me, this often meant sitting on a park bench and watching the lake and all of its comings and goings for a while before getting up to walk down the lakefront and over to the beach house. I slowly wandered across the park and over to this old wooden bench that went over a creek that fed into the lake. This led to a small sidewalk that extended to a side access road. People liked to set up lawn chairs and sit in the grass in this area. There was also this large tree that had to have been there for more than a century and served as a natural rally point. I was approaching that tree when I stopped to take in the view. It was at this point I realized I'd left my phone at home. There were no chairs up that day, and I was the only one on the sidewalk. Traffic on the main road had been pretty light, and there was only one car parked on the access road. It was a perfect day. As I stood there, though, I heard the unmistakable sound of a car slowly pulling up behind me. I didn't think anything of it at first. I fully expected the vehicle to just pass me by and pull up into one of the parking spots. However, it didn't do so. My next thought was that my dad may have come down to see what I was up to. He also liked to hang out at the same park I did. But when I didn't hear the familiar greeting, I started to pay closer attention. I always look like I'm totally lost in thought when I'm out there, but I actually do keep a pretty good eye on my surroundings. The vehicle behind me was putting me on edge. Once in a while, people stop at odd spots to snap pictures of the lake, but I got the distinct feeling that it was not the lake that was being watched right now. I peered over my shoulder and saw a red Ford minivan sitting there. The windows were heavily tinted, but I could make out that there was a man sitting in the driver's seat, and he was looking right at me. The thing that got me the most was the side of the front license plate. It read, and I kid you not, Skinner. I gave this van a good once-over to let the driver know that I had seen him. I also did my best to make my posture seem like I was not nervous. I was alert. I decided to move a bit further down the sidewalk, like I wasn't unsettled by Mr. Skinner in his minivan. I stopped again when I heard the sound of his tires rolling over the pavement. He was following me, doing his best to keep about 10 feet away. I started going over what-if scenarios in my head. I could see a creep wanting to hang around and stalk me if I was an attractive woman or something, but I'm a fat guy of average height, so I never considered I would be the target of an abduction. I glanced around again and saw no one else walking down the sidewalk. It was just me and in this van. I decided to walk off the concrete and into the grass, like I was going to stand by the water. I made my way around that big tree and stood out of sight. I listened in for the sound of van doors opening, but all I heard was the sound of the engine idling. The driver wasn't getting out, but he wasn't leaving either. I began to wonder how long he would sit there and wait, so I stayed out of sight for a good 10 minutes, hoping he would get bored. Finally, at that point, I saw a figure coming from the direction of the beach. It was an old man, maybe in his late 70s. I reached into my pocket where I kept a knife. I figured this old guy was going to be my ticket to break this waiting game with Mr. Skinner. Here he was either going to make his move, in which case I would be ready, or he was going to bug out because we weren't alone anymore. As the old man got closer, I could tell he was eyeing me and the minivan. I came from around the tree and back into Skinner's view and began walking towards the old man. My hand was still in my pocket as I approached him. He looked a little unsure of me. I made a big show of being very friendly with him. I contemplated telling this old guy the van was following me and to call the police, but I decided not to. When we finally got within a few feet of each other, we struck up a conversation. I started commenting on how great a day it was for a walk. I heard the minivan move again. It crept past us back onto the main road and drove away. The old man turned to watch it, and after it was gone, he made mention that the guy inside had just been sitting there staring at me. I laughed a bit and told the man that's why I'd been behind the tree in the first place. The old man went about his own way, and I milled around that part of the sidewalk for about 5 minutes, trying to figure out what the guy in the minivan wanted and why he chose that for a license plate. I happened to look back towards the park, and just beyond that was my car. I had parked just off the main intersection because the park was right there. I thought about turning around and heading back and calling it quits and moving on from that strange ordeal. That's when I saw him once more. He was turning onto the main east-west street and heading my way again. I took out my knife and flipped open the blade. I started picking at my thumbnail with it. He missed the turn to get back onto the side road, but he slowed way down and stared straight at me the entire time. This time, I made sure he saw my knife in my hand. Once he fully passed by, he accelerated and vanished in the same direction he had gone the first time. I was pretty confident he would make a third pass, and if I was still in the open and alone, he would come back, and we would have another weird standoff. Whatever he was up to, I wasn't going to be out in the open for him. If he really wanted me, he'd have to come looking. I walked further down by the beach. There was a lot of tree cover there, and there were a few cubbies for people to sit in and watch the beach. I camped out in one and waited for the van to come back. I figured he wasn't coming back after about a half an hour, and at that point, I just wanted to go home. I walked back the way I had come from, keeping a watchful eye out for the van. I'm glad to say he never did make his return. To this day, I have no idea what that guy wanted. His plates were Wisconsin plates, but I had never seen that van before. I asked around town, and no one else could recall a van of that same make and model, not even with the particularly distinct license plate. I still think about it from time to time and often wonder what would have happened if he had gotten out of his van. I always envisioned he had a syringe or something he would have stuck into my arm and knocked me out. From there, I don't know. Thinking about this incident is always followed by the hope that he hasn't tried something like this with someone else. After all, Wisconsin is the state that gave us Ed Gein and Jeffrey Dahmer. I'm extremely grateful that the old man walked up when he did so I didn't have to find out what Mr. Skinner's real motives were. I should preface this by saying I have some pretty severe agoraphobia. This has meant I haven't been outside in years. I've done a lot of therapy, though, and I'm starting to make my way back into the world very, very slowly. One of the ways I'm starting to get back on it is walking, not far, only a kilometer or so, and not very far from my home either. I go out when it's very quiet, very early in the morning or fairly late in the evening. This is because my agoraphobia is around people and social interaction more than the actual outside. A few days ago, I was walking along like I do, headphones and without music. I like the noise-canceling effect. I was doing my best, a little worn out, but determined to do this to improve my health. As I was walking down the street at the start of my little loop, though, I started to hear the bushes rustling. I looked over to them. It was a bit breezy, and I'm not that paranoid. Only this rustling seemed oddly rhythmic. I kept walking, and along the way, the bushes next to me would rustle at odd intervals. I stopped and looked at them a bit closer. I took my headphones off. When I did, my heart leapt into my throat. I could hear someone breathing, actually quietly panting. I looked around for where the hedge broke and could see a person slip through. I could see that back the way I'd come, the hedge went all the way around the corner. I turned tail and huffed back. Last night, I went out again, having convinced myself it must have been a breeze or maybe I was just being weird and having a hallucination or something. Despite this, I reversed the loop, so the hedge was at the end of the walk. Now, today, unlike the other day, the street lights were on, which was much better. I took my headphones off to be safe and was finishing my walk on the hedge-lined street when I heard it again, the rustling, only this time with the lighting, I could see the bush beside me actually moving. It was shaking back and forth. I backed up a few steps and contemplated going back the long way around. That meant passing the end of the row of hedges where whoever it was could pop out and attack me. Instead, I speed walked down the path beside the hedge. I was going faster this time, so I could hear the other person jogging to get ahead of me and shaking the bushes the whole time. I could hear them panting. I could even hear them giggle when I stumbled. I got to the edge, and on the corner, the hedge had been cut back so it was baler. I could see through it as I hurried past, and I just about caught the silhouette of somebody raked thin, crouched in the bushes with their back heaving and panting breaths. Before I could register it, I was already around the corner and hurrying home, checking over my shoulder every 2 steps. Safe to say I haven't been back out for a walk today. I don't know what the weirdo was up to, but I don't want to run into him again. My story happened a few hours ago. I was watching the Champions League final with friends at a friend's house, less than 2 kilometers from my own. At the end of the match, everybody was going their own ways home. My friends left me at an intersection because they lived on the other side. Now, I was all alone. To get home, I have to go through a passage, kind of like a mini forest, to save time. It was completely dark because the town hall turns off the lights at 10 p.m. When I got closer to home, arriving near the forest area, I got a bad feeling that rarely ever happened to me when walking this path. I told myself that it was nothing and that I shouldn't worry too much. I was wrong. I could hear some sounds flashing in the distance for at least 30 seconds, then nothing. I didn't necessarily pay much attention to it, even though it was really weird. After a few seconds, though, I got an even more intense bad feeling as if someone was staring down on me. I could hear footsteps. My brain told me to look behind me immediately, and when I turned around, I saw a figure walking very discreetly. They were crouched down with what I believed to be a knife in their hands. Seeing this, I ran like I'd never run before. I heard the steps behind me accelerating for about 10 seconds. I no longer heard them after, but I continued to sprint either way. I even fell to the ground about 200 m from my house. What frightened me the most during this chase is that during that time, the guy hadn't said a single word. All I could hear was his footsteps and his heavy breathing. I returned home without ever looking back. I then stayed on my terrace with my mother to tell her everything. Thankfully, it seemed the guy did not continue to chase me because I did not see him pass in front of my house. One night on my cousin's farm, me, my 2 cousins, and 2 family friends were sitting on some hay bales as it got dark out, waiting for the coyotes to come out. Me and the 2 family friends decided it would be funny for one of us to throw a shoe to make some noise, then ditch my cousin on the hay bale. The 4 of us ran to the barn when my cousin stayed behind. We stayed in the barn for a good 30 minutes, waiting for her to come find us, but she never did. We went to check on her, but she wasn't there. We found her back inside the house. The creepy part is when we talked to her, she asked which of us had been running around banging on the fence. We got really confused because we had run straight for the barn, so we asked her what she meant. Apparently, she had seen a person sneaking around in a black sweatshirt with the hood up. They had taken a stick and were just smacking it against the fence several times. She had thought it was us since we'd all been wearing black hoodies. We were certain she wasn't lying because she asked us first and proudly declared we did not scare her. The next day, all 5 of us were out fishing when my uncle said there had been 2 people out walking around by the gravel pit near the hay bales who he thought was 2 of us. We still don't know who that was sneaking out there that night nor what their main goal was. I'm 25, born and raised in Arizona. This literally just happened to me, so I decided to share it with all of you wonderful people. This evening, I'm a huge stoner, and so I don't drive. I decided to take a bus a few miles down to the dispensary. This was at about 8:30, I believe. I wanted to get a new indica cart, Purple Punch. It's my favorite by far. I got it and walked back towards the bus stop to head back home. As I walked closer to the bus bench, though, I noticed a guy was already sitting there. I didn't really think much of it. I'm antisocial, and so I always go into any social setting ready to be absolutely silent. I didn't even get a chance to do that this time. As I'm sitting down, he started asking me something. I had my headphones on, though, so I couldn't quite tell what he was saying. I took them off and asked him what he'd said. He responded, "Did you want to get your hair cut?" while staring at me with very wide eyes, not blinking at all. If I were a betting man, I'd say this guy was on something. I'm not here to judge anybody. I understand addiction very well. I just definitely was not expecting that question. I think I'm all right. I then noticed he was wearing an Arizona Cardinals uniform. I just so happen to be an Arizona Cardinals fan myself, so since my entire socializing ability revolves around sports, I decided to ask him, "Hey, you a Cardinals fan?" He looked at me kind of funny for a second. "No, I just got this a few months ago." "Oh, okay. So how long you been cutting hair without blinking?" He answered immediately, "Just picked it up a few months ago." "Who taught you how to cut it?" I asked, even more sketched out at this point. His eyes shifted, and he said, "I learned on my own." "Come on, man, let me touch up the back a little bit." Mind you, he was consistently pushing to cut my hair throughout this entire conversation. I even told him, "Yo, I don't have any cash on me right now," indicating I couldn't even pay for the service even if I wanted to. He simply said it was no problem and that he had his clippers in his bag. I decided to just be real with the guy. "Hey, listen, I just don't feel comfortable getting haircuts from people I don't know, like at night and stuff. You feel me?" The guy never changed facial expressions for the entire interaction. He finally just said, "True that," and continued to glare into my soul, basically. I decided in that moment it was about time to just get out of here. Luckily, the bus stop was right in front of our local Circle K, a gas station for those who aren't familiar. I walked in there for a few minutes just to kill time and get away from this guy. Unfortunately, the bus was not showing up for another 17. I didn't want to stay long, though. I didn't want the employees to think I was trying to steal or something. Granted, I had a pretty good reason to be inside at the time. I waited about 6 to 7 minutes. Literally, as I'm walking out, I see the haircut guy walking in, staring into my soul once more. Luckily, I just walked past him and fled out of there to another bus stop down the street. The bus finally arrived. I saw the dude at the back of the bus, but he didn't try to bother me anymore. I made sure to keep my eyes the complete opposite of his direction the entire time. I tend to overthink most social situations I'm in, even if they're extremely quick. But how would you have handled that situation? Would you have let this guy cut your hair? A few years back, I rented an apartment from a friend of mine. He had recently bought it and had it completely renovated. He put it up for sale, but couldn't find a buyer, so I offered to rent it in the meantime. After moving in, I quickly realized there was something wrong with the lady next door. She was around 45, but looked much older, and she would sit up all night listening to Christian radio shows and talking loudly to someone. It got to the point where I couldn't even sleep, so I went over to her place and asked her to keep it down, please. She opened her door, and I quickly got a peek at her walls. They all had crosses painted on them in different colors, and words like Jesus and angel scribbled everywhere. The windows had been painted black, letting in no light at all. There were damp yellow-stained 50-year-old carpets with dog crap and cockroaches everywhere, no dog in sight though. I asked her to keep it down once more. She gave me this crazy look and slammed the door shut in my face. She turned up the radio even louder the next night. I had my girlfriend staying over. I woke up in the middle of the night to see a shadow of a person next to the bed looking down at us sleeping. I thought I was hallucinating, as I usually do in the dark when I'm sleepy. But then the shadow started talking. It was my neighbor. She was holding something in her hand. She'd broken in sometime during the night, and who knows how long she was standing there. She walked out soon after. The next morning, I could hear someone making strange noises below my bedroom window. It was my neighbor talking to herself in tongues again. At this point, I was beyond scared. She was obviously very ill. I went upstairs and knocked on another person's door and asked what the hell was going on. The guy was just as scared as I was. Apparently, she'd broken into his apartment one evening as well while he was watching television with his kids. He got up from the couch to get a snack, only to find her hiding behind the couch, staring at him, holding a power drill in hand. Now I know what she was holding in her hand that night. At this stage, I was basically hysterical. I called the cops, and they knew all about her. Apparently, she was a violent schizophrenic and hadn't taken her meds in quite some time. They couldn't force her to or enter her apartment without her permission because she owned it. The only thing they could do was get her when she went outside. I sat up for the next 2 weeks waiting for her to run out of cigarettes. When I heard her leave at 2 a.m. to go across the road to 7-Eleven, I called the cops. They had 3 cars and a special van over in less than 2 minutes. They restrained her and tossed her in the van and drove her off to some special institution. It all happened in less than a minute. It's like she was never there. I never saw her again after. I still have nightmares about her looking down at me in my sleep. This happened to me when I was about 8 years old, and it still scares me to this day. One evening, I went to let my dogs in from the back garden at around 9 p.m. or so. It was pitch black outside, so I quickly opened the door, and my dogs came bounding in. As soon as they came inside, and I'd locked the door, at that exact moment, a person on the other side stood up and pulled the handle down, trying to get into my house. We had a glass door, so even in the dark, I could make out the outline of the man standing there. I ran to my dad, and he ran into the back garden after the man. I saw him running down the road to chase him. Unfortunately, the man got away. Ever since then, I've always closed and locked all doors at the speed of light whenever I go outside or come back in. I don't want to risk another split-second action of someone possibly getting into my home ever again. One of the scariest things I've ever heard was when I worked in retail. The store I worked at used to do layaway, and that was where I worked, right by the layaway counter. We had 3 bathrooms, a men's multi-stall, a women's multi-stall, and a family bathroom. Only the family bathroom had a door that locked. All the others had a push/pull swing door. I was in the back cleaning up when I thought I heard someone screaming. I walked out front by the counter, and I heard more screaming. I was not sure at first where it was coming from. I ran and checked in the men's and the women's bathroom, but they were both empty. I could still hear the crying and screaming, though. It seemed it was coming from the family bathroom. I banged on the door, but the yelling, screaming, and crying kept going. I called for a manager because I had no way of getting inside since it was locked. This whole time it was still screaming and crying. After several attempts of trying to open the door, we finally called 911. We had no idea what was going on inside, but clearly it was nothing good. This went on for about 15 minutes at this point, though it felt like forever. Then the sound suddenly stopped. No more crying, no more screaming. We banged on the door until the police came. When they finally did, they had to kick it in since we couldn't find the key. As we all stood around and looked in, all we saw was blood all over the place. We were not sure what happened at first, but the police told us to back up. That's when they pulled out a lady completely soaked in blood. We all just stood there in shock. This woman was not moving, and we all thought she must be dead. They took the lady away. We all had to give statements. This story is not scary in a ghost sense, but for that to happen right behind the door and to not know what was going on, the utter helplessness of it all was very scary to me. To really get my story, you have to have an understanding of my 3rd floor landing. There's a single set of stairs that lead up to it. Once on the landing, it's a T-shape with an office on the left, my bedroom to the right, and straight ahead being a bathroom with a shower inside. One night at about 1 a.m. or so, I was taking a shower before I went to sleep. The glass panels on my shower are that convex glass that blurs everything, so everything was blurred and unclear outside. As I was taking the shower, I glanced through the glass door to the rest of the bathroom, only to see a hand reach over to the light switch. All they did was hit the lights. That's it. No noises, no sudden attack, nothing. Whoever it was had simply turned off the lights. So there I am. I just saw someone's hand reach into the bathroom, and now I'm in my shower in the pitch black. I'd never been so chilled to the bone before. Something about being in the darkness of night, with only the noise of water hitting the floor beneath you being around it, really reduced me to my most primal state of pure fear. I never felt like that before or since. I eventually somehow convinced myself to leave the safety of the shower and hit the lights back on. The relief that came over me was immense. I've never been able to explain it, though. The stairs up to the landing are old and they creak like hell, surely. I would have heard someone coming and going up and down, but I didn't, and there was no one there. No one was in my room or the office. What was even more weird was that nothing like it has ever happened since. Whoever had done it didn't seem to have done anything except turn off the lights. Let me start by saying that I was really only looking to hook up. I had just been dumped by my boyfriend, and I'm not the bar type. I figured that an online dating service would be a more reasonable option. I used a local personal service, and I've been talking to this guy for about 2 days before agreeing to meet up with him. His name was Mike, and he told me that he used online dating because he was suffering from depression and was on a medication that made it hard for him to perform. He decided it was easier to meet women this way so they could know beforehand than to meet up in person and have to explain when they started getting physical. He went on to tell me, though, that he had a good feeling about me and that I was exciting to him despite his medication. Okay, seemed cool enough. I decided to go over to his place to see if we really did have any chemistry. We both seemed to be looking for the same thing, a hookup. When I got there, he was waiting for me in the living room. We started making out, and I could tell he was getting a little aroused, but was having some issues. When he said that he knew what would help and that it was in his bedroom, I willingly followed. Walking in, I couldn't help but notice his bed being surrounded by cat condos, lots and lots of them, some structured to be as tall as I was. I knew that he had cats, but I assumed he'd meant 1 or 2 and that they were just hiding when I came over. Nope, he had 10, which all came out from underneath the bed when we sat on it. They all rushed out and went to their perches on the cat condos to watch us after rubbing against him. He then went on to start making out with me again and was massively aroused. At this point, I was massively creeped out, though. I like cats, and I have some myself, but having them watch me pee freaks me out, much less them watching me be intimate with someone. I excused myself, openly admitting this was a little bit too strange for me. I left, and he followed me, begging me to give him another chance and help him. I left anyway. For the next few days, he continued to message me, asking me to come over and saying he'd made some real progress with me. I blocked him after receiving a photo of him nude on the bed, surrounded by the cats. I am the oldest of 3 kids. I have a younger sister who was 8 at the time of this incident and a brother who was 6, while I myself was 12. For years, we lived in a relatively rural area. We weren't too far from a bigger city, but we couldn't see our nearest neighbors from our house. We had plenty of space to play in. Back then, those were happy times. My dad worked from home for one of the countless companies that started up during the big dot-com boom in the 90s and made a good bit of money. That all ended with the crash in the early 2000s. My father lost his job, so we were forced to sell the house and move to a less expensive place in the city while he looked for more work. The house must have been glamorous in its day. There were 3 stories, and it was very spacious, even containing 2 staircases leading upstairs, a main one in the front and a smaller one in the kitchen. Sadly, the house had not been kept up with and was not in good shape anymore. It was also not in a good neighborhood either. It wasn't exactly a ghetto or anything, but it was definitely run down and shady. That's how we managed to get it for a price we could still afford. I remember being excited at the time because even as a little girl, I was always interested in ghosts and monsters, and it seemed like we were moving into a haunted house. I wish this was just a ghost story, but sadly, as they say, the living are far more terrifying than the dead. During this time, my dad changed from the loving father he had always been to someone completely different, someone we were all very much afraid of. He struggled to find any stable work and began drinking as well. That would often make him very violent and abusive. Most of the time, it was over money. He could drink away every last cent, but how dare my mother buy food or an occasional toy for us? His rage was usually directed at my mom, but if any of us kids dared to draw his attention during one of his rampages, he was always more than willing to turn on us and share the love. As the oldest, I was very protective of my younger siblings. I would usually round them up and quietly head across the street to a small park whenever my dad would start in that way. We were safer if we didn't make him angry. He would leave us alone, usually. We'd head back around dark, and he would be in bed pasted out by then. One night, however, he was in a particularly foul mood. The yelling was worse than ever. I could even hear him from the playground all the way across the street. When darkness rolled around several hours later, we finally headed home. I could still hear him yelling at my mom from the inside. Then I heard my mother screaming in pain and fear, and the sound of glass breaking. I knew that something was wrong. I knew this was worse than usual. I told my brother and sister to go to the neighbors and get help, but my sister was terrified and wouldn't leave my side. My 6-year-old brother ran next door alone while we cautiously approached the house. When we got inside, we saw our mom lying in the middle of the living room floor, bleeding. The furniture in the room was overturned, and the glass coffee table was shattered all over the floor. When she saw us, a look of terror came into her eyes. She gasped to run, but it was already too late. My dad heard us coming in and had hidden behind the front door, which he slammed shut and stepped in front of. In his hand was a large kitchen knife soaked in my mother's blood. His eyes were filled with rage. We did the only thing we could do and ran into the kitchen for the back door. He was fast enough to cut us off before we could get outside. He flipped over the kitchen table in front of the door and screamed, "Where do you think you're going?" We scrambled up the back staircase, and I slammed the door, separating it from the kitchen, and locked it. We were far from safe. There was nowhere for us to go but upstairs. My father beat on the door for several seconds, then stormed off toward the main staircase. I quietly opened the door and pulled my sister toward the basement instead of going upstairs. We had a playroom and a small living room. I slid the love seat up from the wall enough so my sister could get behind it and lay down. I then pushed it back as close to the wall as I could without crushing her. I did the same for myself with the couch. We laid there in terror for what felt like hours. I could hear my father shaking the house with his rage upstairs, looking all around for us. It sounded like he was flipping furniture and breaking down doors. He eventually figured out we weren't up there and did the same thing on the ground floor. I heard him coming down to the basement and cried silently in terror. Just as I could see his feet step off the final stair, there was a crash upstairs and loud footsteps rushing into the home. My dad retreated into the dark corner of the basement until eventually the police worked their way downstairs and arrested him. Even after they took him away, I was still too scared to move. They eventually found us and took us upstairs where my mother was being loaded into an ambulance. Thankfully, she survived, although I believe he would have killed her if we hadn't come home at that exact moment. We've never seen my father since. He wrote from prison a few times, but my mom never let us read the letters. All she did was tell us he said he was sorry, but that's all she would say. We never went to visit him and moved across the country shortly after. He's still locked up as far as I know. As you can imagine, the entire family spent years in counseling after that night. My younger sister has attempted suicide twice, and I still have nightmares and trust issues to this day. I don't think any of us will ever completely get over it. I'm 24 now, and I still live with the effects of that one night to this day. When someone who was supposed to protect you and care for you turns into the one you should be afraid of, it's really traumatic. You never fully get over that, and you never truly trust anyone again.